During the final stages of the sinking of the RMS Titanic, as the ship's bow slowly sank deeper and deeper into the sea, the ship's stern was slowly rising higher and higher into the air. Those that were in the lifeboats around the rapidly sinking Titanic could do nothing except watch in horror as their vessel slowly sank before their eyes. Then, suddenly and without warning, this massive bang was heard coming from the Titanic, and then a moment later the ship's power went nearly completely out. Now, as everyone in the lifeboat struggled to see what the Titanic was doing, it was a lot more difficult to see what the ship was doing now that the power was out, they noticed something odd. Whereas a moment before, the ship's stern was slowly rising higher and higher into the air, now, after the loud bang and power failure, it seemed like the Titanic's stern had settled back and was more or less level with the water. At first, no one in the lifeboats knew what to make of this, but then suddenly it dawned on them. The Titanic had just broken in half, and everyone in the lifeboats could not believe their eyes. Then, a few minutes later, the Titanic's stern went nearly completely vertical once again, and slowly but surely sank beneath the waves. Now, the fact that the Titanic broke in two is more or less common knowledge among those who are interested in the story of the Titanic. However, what isn't common knowledge is to have an understanding as to why exactly the Titanic broke in two, and where exactly did the Titanic break into. Well, those are the questions that we're going to be looking to answer in today's video. I hope you enjoy. Special thanks to Titanic Honor and Glory for providing the sinking animation you're going to see in today's video. Please check out their work in the description below. Now, the first thing we need to go over in order for all of you to properly understand why the Titanic broke in half is first discuss what exactly happens to a ship when it is flooding that ultimately causes it to sink. You see, as water comes rushing inside of a vessel's hull, the water doesn't, as some people believe, cause a ship to get heavier, and this is what causes it to sink. What actually happens is, as water floods inside of a vessel, the water causes the ship to lose buoyancy. And what ultimately decides if or if not a vessel is going to sink is if the amount of buoyancy that is still in a ship can overcome the amount of buoyancy that is lost in the areas that are taking on water. If the amount of buoyancy left over can resist the buoyancy lost in the areas that flooded, then the ship will remain afloat. However, if it can't, the vessel will eventually founder. Now, this begs the question, how much buoyancy could the RMS Titanic lose and still be able to remain afloat? Well, the answer to this question is a little bit complicated, and in order to properly explain it, you first need to have a basic understanding of one of the Titanic's key safety features, and that is the watertight bulkheads. The watertight bulkheads, seen here in this image represented in red, were these giant bulkheads that were designed to separate each of the Titanic's individual watertight compartments from each other. That way, if one of the compartments was breached and water began to make its way inside, the water would not be able to move from the damaged watertight compartment into another watertight compartment that was undamaged. Now, the Titanic had 16 individual watertight compartments inside the ship, separated by 15 individual watertight bulkheads. These watertight bulkheads went all the way up to the Titanic's E-deck level. Now, it's important to note that these watertight compartments, the bulkheads did not completely seal up one compartment from the next by being closed off at the top of the compartment. Each of the Titanic's watertight compartments was open at the top. However, this was not a design flaw put into the Titanic by the ship's designers. This was a conscious decision put into the ship by them. And the reason why is because the designers thought it wasn't necessary to completely seal up one compartment from another by being closed up at the top. And this is simply because of how water works. So let's pretend, for the sake of a discussion, that one watertight compartment in the Titanic right around here was breached, okay? And water was coming into that compartment. Well, you see, by default, water will not flood up higher inside of a ship than where the water currently is on the outside of a vessel. So in order for water to be able to flood a compartment and get up so high in that compartment for it to be able to spill over the top of the bulkhead and flood the next undamaged compartment, the Titanic would have to sink down so low in the water, and just pretend my arm's the water for the sake of this discussion, that the watertight bulkhead was under the waterline on the outside of the ship. If that was the case, the water would easily be able to spill over the tops of the bulkheads and flood the next undamaged compartment. However, for this to happen, it would take a colossal amount of damage to the Titanic for it to sink that deep. However, how much damage would it take? Well, let's talk about it. So the answer to this question depends on two big factors. Number 1, how many watertight compartments within the ship were breached? And number 2, where within the ship were the watertight compartments breached? Because depending on the location would greatly determine how many watertight compartments the Titanic could lose and not founder. So let's say, for the sake of argument, the ship had some watertight compartments damaged, maybe somewhere along the midship point, maybe further aft. Well, in these areas of the Titanic, officially the ship could lose 2 watertight compartments in these areas and still be buoyant enough to remain afloat. Maybe, under the best case scenario, 3 watertight compartments could be breached in this area and the ship would not sink. However, 3 compartments breached in the mid or aft end parts of the ship, that's really pushing it, and I don't know for certain if the ship could survive under those circumstances. That's just something I heard. However, this entire thing changes if the Titanic was damaged in the bow section of the ship. You see, the designers thought that if there was going to be damage to the Titanic that resulted in a hull breach, that it was most likely to happen in the front part of the Titanic. So in the front part of the ship, the Titanic could remain afloat with her first 4 watertight compartments breached. Even with this massive amount of damage, the rest of the Titanic would remain buoyant enough to keep the bow from sinking down so low in the water that the water would be able to spill over the tops of the bulkheads. So in this scenario, the Titanic would be safe from sinking. Okay, so now that all of you watching this video now have a good understanding of how buoyancy works and how much buoyancy the Titanic could lose and not sink, let's now go over briefly what exactly happened to the Titanic on the night she struck the iceberg and sank into the Atlantic Ocean. Oh, and by the way, guys, we only really just briefly went over the safety features of the Titanic in this video. I did cover them a lot more extensively in another video. If you would like to watch that video, I will include a link to that video in the description below. I hope you guys will check it out. Now, the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April the 14th, 1912. She made contact with berg at the front of the ship on the starboard side below the waterline. Now, as the Titanic scraped past the iceberg put a bunch of small punctures in the Titanic's hull, covering a space from the front of the ship to just after the first funnel. This much space of the Titanic's hull had a bunch of small little punctures in it from the iceberg impact. Now, because the damage covered this much space of the Titanic's hull, the Titanic lost her first 6 watertight compartments to the sea. With that much damage to the Titanic's hull and that much buoyancy lost, there was literally no hope in saving the Titanic. The Titanic's bow would sink down so low in the water that the water would have no trouble spilling over the tops of the bulkheads and traveling further and further and further back into the ship, and the Titanic would slowly lose more and more buoyancy as this process continued until the Titanic would eventually founder.
Now, even though the Titanic's watertight bulkheads would not be able to save the Titanic due to the iceberg damage, they would still be useful in delaying the rate at which the Titanic would sink, because as the water flooded deeper and deeper into the ship, the water would still have to fill up each individual watertight compartment before it would be able to spill over the tops of the bulkheads and flow into the next compartment. So the Titanic, thanks to the watertight bulkheads, did take a lot longer to sink than what it would have without the watertight compartments. Now, as the Titanic continued to flood, the ship would lose buoyancy in the bow first, because this is where the water was coming in at. However, thanks to the watertight bulkheads, the water would not be able to flow into the Titanic's stern section right away. So because of this, the Titanic's stern, which was still completely positively buoyant, would slowly rise into the air as the Titanic's bow sank deeper and deeper into the sea.
Now, once the Titanic's bow section had completely filled with water, the entire front part of the ship had lost nearly all of its buoyancy and was essentially just dead weight that wanted to free fall down to the bottom of the ocean. But because the Titanic's stern was still more or less 100% positively buoyant, it was resisting that pull. Think of it like this. Both sides of the Titanic were acting on each other with opposing forces. Now, because this was happening, it was putting a lot of strain on parts of the Titanic's hull where the designers thought there would be no strain or forces acting on them at all. Those that were on board the Titanic during this process said they could hear the ship's hull flexing and groaning as more and more forces were bearing on them. Now, there is one incredibly terrifying piece of testimony from the Titanic's chief baker, Charles Yelkin, who, during the final stages of the sinking, and when I say final stages of the sinking, I mean it. I'm talking about the time where the Titanic's bridge was going under, so definitely final stages. He was in the Titanic's A-deck pantry, which was just after the third funnel. What was he doing in the pantry, I hear you asking? Well, Charles Yelkin made it his mission to make sure that the Titanic went down with as little alcohol on board as possible. I am exaggerating that a bit, but Charles Yelkin's story is definitely one of the craziest from the entire Titanic story. I did make a dedicated video about him. If you would like to watch it, I will include a link to that video in the description below. Anyway, while Charles Yelkin was in the pantry getting a drink, he said that he could hear steel beams snapping and breaking within the ship. And when he heard that, he was like, okay, I need to get out of the pantry now. And once he left the pantry, he headed for the Titanic's stern. So, as you can see, the Titanic's hull was under incredible strain during the sinking, and it was only getting worse as the Titanic sank deeper and deeper into the sea. Now, even though the Titanic's stern was slowly being lifted up out of the water throughout the entire sinking, as the Titanic began its final plunge, the process of lifting the stern up out of the water and into the sky began to rapidly accelerate. Now, the higher up the stern went, this was around the time that another force that was located within the stern began to put even more strain on the Titanic's hull. You see, located in the aft end part of the Titanic, more specifically just after the Titanic's third funnel, is the Titanic's engine room. And within the engine room, the Titanic's two massive reciprocating engines and its low-pressure turbine engine, well, these were some of the heaviest objects within the Titanic. The Titanic's two massive reciprocating steam engines, well, these engines weighed around 900 tons apiece. So, as the Titanic's stern section was being lifted up into the air, these engines were trying to keep the Titanic's stern from rising up at all. They wanted the Titanic's stern to stay more or less level with the water. So as the stern was being lifted up higher and higher into the air, it began to put a bending force on the Titanic's hull, somewhere around the ship's midpoint. So the higher up the Titanic's stern went, the more and more the Titanic's hull was beginning to bend under the strain right around the ship's midsection.
As the Titanic's bow section continued to plunge deeper and deeper into the sea, the Titanic's stern section was continuing to be lifted up higher and higher into the sky. The bending forces happening to the Titanic's midship point were about to reach their breaking point. The Titanic's hull was beginning to buckle and snap apart as the ship climbed higher and higher into the sky. And then, finally, when the hull couldn't take it any longer, it happened.
Now, the Titanic broke in two right around this area right here, the space just forward of the Titanic's third funnel. This is roughly the breakup point. Now, there was considerable debate for quite a while, probably ever since the wreck of the Titanic was discovered, as to where exactly the Titanic broke in half. Back in the 1990s, it was most commonly believed that the ship broke into somewhere around this area right here, the space in between the third and fourth funnel. And my best guess is as to why people thought this was probably based on observations made at the Titanic stern section. If you take a look at this picture of the Titanic stern section, you can see the hole where the fourth funnel once stood right there. And it clearly does look like from this image that the Titanic did break into somewhere in between the third and fourth funnel. However, after they did more expeditions to the wreck site and they studied it a bit more, they soon realized that they were wrong. The Titanic actually broke into just forward of the third funnel. And I'll explain how they reached this conclusion in just a second. Now, the Titanic's bow and stern sections are separated by a pretty great distance on the wreck site today. I believe it's somewhere around 2,500 feet or so of distance between the bow and stern section. And because the Titanic stern section did this weird spiraling thing as it fell down to the bottom of the ocean, the Titanic stern section is actually facing in the opposite direction from the bow section. Now, during an expedition to the Titanic wreck site, the researchers discovered something odd. You see, they found these random big chunks of metal and debris at the bottom of the ocean separated from the Titanic wreck site. And they found two of these huge chunks of metal and debris. Now, upon first glance, they didn't know what this was. I mean, obviously they knew it was from Titanic, but it didn't really resemble any part of the ship at all. At first, they were confused about this, but then after they did a little bit of investigating, they soon figured out what these crazy pieces of metal and debris were.
Take a look at this image of the wreck of the Titanic as it would appear today at the bottom of the ocean if the bow and stern sections were lined up with each other. As you can clearly see from this image, and I'll circle this area right here in green, there is a huge chunk of the Titanic's hull and superstructure that is missing from the main shipwreck today at the bottom of the ocean. Where did this huge chunk of the Titanic go? Well, as it turns out, these missing chunks of the Titanic are those two big chunks of metal and debris that those researchers found at the bottom of the ocean.
Now, eventually, researchers digitally reconstructed the Titanic using these two big pieces of jagged metal and debris. And what they discovered, to their amazement, was they represented a space of the Titanic's hull that went from just forward of the Titanic's third funnel to just forward of the Titanic's fourth funnel. When they saw this, they were blown away, and they knew that this would completely change their understanding of how the Titanic broke in half. Now, based on where these two big chunks of metal came from the Titanic itself, they eventually decided to call these big pieces of metal Tower 1 and Tower 2. I've also heard the names Forward and Aft Tower thrown around as well.
The image you see here is a rough representation of where those two big pieces of jagged metal and debris from Titanic came from. The red line you see represents the spot where the Titanic broke in half, the blue line you see represents Tower 1 or Forward Tower, and the green line you see represents Tower 2 or the Aft Tower.
So yeah, once researchers digitally reconstructed the Titanic using these missing fragments of the ship, they discovered to their amazement that the Titanic did not break in half just after the third funnel like what they originally thought. It turns out the Titanic actually broke in two, as I stated earlier, just forward of the Titanic's third funnel. And with that, now all of you watching this video now know why the Titanic broke in half, and you also know exactly where the Titanic broke in half. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave this video a like. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot. And if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you guys so much for all your support. And I hope to see all of you in the next official Historic Travels video. Y'all take care.
Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.